All right. I'm pretty certain I'm recording. Oh, maybe this is recording the right way. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the third tip today is to work on the script. What do I mean by work on the script? If you look at the, oh no, that is not what you want to see. Better? Okay. Work on the script. That is our studio. The top left component is going to be either a script or a markdown file. We'll use markdown files. The markdown file is where you will edit your code and run. Okay? The console down at the bottom is actually where the code is run. So what will happen is when you run something, it takes the commands up in the top left and then chunks them down to the bottom left part, and that's what's actually run. So if you look, if you highlight the code there and hit run, you get what's down below in the console, and that's where your results pop up. You may or may not see results pop up from the script itself. That happens with the markdown files. The top right box contains the environment, and those are the objects in your section that you can refer to better. So after running the code I just did, where we put the x to be 2 plus 2, which is 4, then you see a value, you see x, which takes on a value of 4. So that tells you what you have to do for. You will see it being populated by data sets, subsets of data, statistical models. It just fills out with whatever it is. The bottom right shows the files in your working directory. Okay, you can actually navigate away from your working directory, but at default, it tells you what's in your working directory. You will have practice with this in Precept, but before we continue, any questions on sort of getting set up and running with R here a little bit? Okay. Feel free to chat on Campus Wire if you'd like. Okay. So today, we're going to run through and discuss differences between types of research methods. So the 4 types we're going to talk about run from the most controlled to the least. The first type is a controlled or laboratory experiment. So a hallmark, or what is essential to a controlled or laboratory experiment, is that the researcher randomizes and administers the treatment and the controlled environment. So we talked about this briefly yesterday in the subpart. The second type is a field experiment. This is what we talked about in the analysis the other day, where the researcher administers the treatment but does not control the environment. The third type of study we'll be talking about is a natural experiment, where there is a treatment that's randomized, but it's not randomized by the researcher. We'll talk about an example of that later in this lecture. And the fourth is a purely descriptive study in which there is no claim that a treatment is being randomized. It's simply looking at data that's been gathered before. We discussed briefly internal and external validity in the previous lecture. Internal validity is the extent to which we're able to isolate an effect of interest by removing the effect of removing the effect of factors. In that case, going from 1 to 4, we have from the highest internal validity to the lowest. When we control the environment and randomize the treatment, we can make sure that links in the environment are found in our study, and we're randomizing the treatment so the treatment is not necessary. In a descriptive study where we just go observe the world, we don't know if some treatment is causing some outcome because the rest of the world is happening. There's a reverse relationship in external validity. External validity means, is this structure or is this pattern that we see in the data likely to be seen in the real world? For a descriptive study, that actually has the highest external validity because we want it to the social world observed. The laboratory control experiment has the lowest external validity Because generally speaking, people don't go into laboratories and set up and try beads and play with each other. Okay? So it's, we don't know, we might find an effect in the lab, but we don't know if it's going to play out in your dorms or things like that. We don't know if it's going to play out in the work. The trade-off, there's the obvious trade-offs where the higher the internal validity, the lower the external, because it requires controlling more. And the higher the external validity they are, the lower the. In the social sciences, we generally settle around 2 and 3 as the most effective studies, because they do allow us to randomize the treatment, either by observing or by actually manipulating it. But it takes place in the real world. So at least this is entirely a personal observation. But the choices that we, but the papers that show up that really excite people, kind of fall into 2 and 3. We will be talking about the roles played by 1 and 4 because they're absolutely crucial to the development of science. Okay? We do need 1 and 4 to be there, and we need to know what puts one study into which of those boxes. So we're going to talk about a controlled experiment, which I actually turned to a couple years ago, and thinking through whether there's gender balance. Where this comes from? When is an increase ups, and that should be finished for most of the people we're trying to take care of. But a concern is gender imbalance increase ups. Another concern I want to take a step. And trying to balance both of those, and it's just a formula for and it reminded me of a study that was done by one of my colleagues, Professor Mendel, and several of her collaborators. And they conducted the following study where, let's see, are all the sometimes, I'm glad everybody sit down, sometimes men can dominate conversations. Okay, good. And that's not precisely what mansplaining is. Mansplaining is a little different. Where Google mansplaining. It's a related concept, but not exactly the same. What the study looked at was how the gender makeup of a community affected the number of interruptions. And the primary treatment was whether or not the group had to make a decision unanimously or by a majority. So let me explain the design of this and what the authors did. They took 2 college towns. One was, it's not my, but one I think pretty third year. One was, I think I'm in Iowa. And what they did was they took groups of 5 people, and this is a laboratory, they controlled the room, and they told people to apportion a certain amount of money. And if they did a particularly good job, they'd be rewarded with money. That was sort of how they said. What was varied was the ratio of men to women in each of the 5 groups. There were either 1 man, 2 men, 3 men, 1. Similarly, 1 got 5 on the side for the treatment was whether the decision had to be made by majority rule or made by a community. Okay? The outcome that they look at, unbeknownst to the research, unbeknownst to the participants, again, that's all part of that problem. Unbeknownst to the participants, they were measuring the proportion of interruptions that were negative. Okay? So 5 people gathered in a room, they were placed in the treatment group of unanimous rule or under the treatment condition of majority rule, and then they recorded it and just tabulated the number of negative interruptions. So, here are the results. Along the x-axis is the number of women. You'll notice it runs from 1 to 4, meaning there's always at least 1 male and 1 female in the group. Then, the y-axis is the proportion of negative and positive interruptions that are negative. How many times does someone get interrupted negatively? Okay, and then you find positive and negative in the paper. Another issue with the study is how to measure before positive and negative, and things like that. People put it up to make sure it's agreement. Go to the paper. It's a really well done piece of scholarship. Then the two lines correspond with the majority rule and community. So what you'll notice is that as the number of women in the group increases under a unanimity rule, so the number of women decreases. Let's go from 4 to 1. As the number of women in the group decreases from 4 to 1, the proportion of interruptions that are negative stays roughly 1. But as the number of women in the group decreases under a majority rule, meaning only 3 people out of 5 to agree to something, the number of negative interruptions goes up. The interesting takeaway of this is not necessarily that powerful. That's one of those things that's just right? One of the interesting takeaways of this is that these dynamics can be affected by institutional roles. As political scientists, just speaking for myself, I'm just as interested in institutions and rules in the state, but just as much institutions and rules as I am about what's inside our own heads. Okay. So the next takeaway I took from this, and people may find other things in it, is that gender relations can be impacted by discussion rules. The point for this particular course is that this was a controlled experiment, and that all of this was done within the confines of a room that was controlled by the researchers. The next study we're going to talk about is hit rooms. This is a natural experiment. It has 2 hallmarks of a natural experiment that one supposes. The first hallmark is that there's a randomization that takes place that the researcher doesn't control. That's just part of the design of this, right? There's an experiment that takes place. The second aspect of this that I want us to pay attention to is that conducting this as a field experiment would be wildly unethical. Okay? So if we can, we try to do field experiments, but sometimes the question this looks at is what is the effect of the assassination of an autocratic leader on the country's democracy? Right? Now, can I walk in front of the IRB board and ask for funding to randomly assassinate political leaders? I mean, like, I could. Is that in any way, shape, or form wise? Yeah. Right? And like, if you want to do that, you're going to take these away. Okay. So, in the sorts of scenarios in which an experiment is fundamentally unethical, we're stuck looking at natural experiments, which involves keen perception of the social world and a certain amount of creativity that you'll see in this particular design. So, this is the effect of assassinations on political institutions in the American economic around 2009. And the authors want to know what's the causal effect of assassination of a political leader on the institution. If a leader is assassinated, is there a tendency post-assassination for the country to turn more or less democratic? The fundamental problem with the design is that the assassination of political leaders is not planned. People just select into it, right? Sometimes it's about the country, sometimes it's about the leader, sometimes it's about the opposition. There's all sorts of reasons why assassinations take place. No one looks at it and goes, that's like rolling the dice. Right? There's all sorts of those underlying. So, can we randomly assassinate political leaders? I want to be efficient on the record and instructors and no. Then, what we can do, and here's the cleverness of this particular design. If we only look at attempted assassinations, right? So we're going to restrict ourselves to incidents of attempted assassination. We can argue that whether or not the assassination succeeded was a matter of chance. Right, like you had a gust of wind on one way versus another, and about 1963, and you would have survived. Right? So this is what the authors do. They say we're only going to look at incidents of attempted assassination. And then within those attempted assassinations, what happens to the successful ones? Arguing that success is in some sense as a haphazard moment. Right? Now, what they find is that assassinating an autocratic leader leads towards a shift towards a more democratic shift. We'll talk about this later in the course, but the political science is a lot of ways to measure how democratic a country is. That's obviously a fraud concept, a broader thing. But we have scales that kind of put us to be on one end and work through on the other. That more or less trustworthy empirical analysis. We'll go into the data, but just take that for now. That we have a reasonable measure of how democratic countries will perform after attack. So by looking at only attempts, we're actually able to argue for a haphazard. Before continuing to the next presentation, for the next paper, one question I had is, what critique would you have of this design? Is there any way this were being presented in your panel or in a seminar, so keeping it presented this argue that given an assassination attempt occurred, whether or not it's succeeded or haphazard, can you offer a critique or two of this? Why did it not be completely rational? What other sorts of confound variables are you look? Yeah. So the last time I tried this, we weren't all wearing masks. Say that one more time. That's
the security that the leader might have.
Oh, okay. So how would that affect the randomization of the success?
If it's a wealthier country that has one of the person, that might be
okay. But wouldn't the assassin take that into consideration in priority?
Probably.
Okay. No. Thank you. By the way, thank you.
How well then is that?
Okay.
I'm sure some are very close and
Oh. And the one you're talking about with how successful the attempt is, let's keep this. I think that's almost there. It's missing. I just want to hear a few more ideas. This is yes.
perhaps the legal ramifications for an assassination attempt.
Okay. Also.
For example, like an assassin that was they live in an autocratic regime, that's like in the event of an assassination, they'll be far less likely to commit that attempt.
Well, we're already looking only at one takes place, so that's just the beginning. We're only looking at the country years where an assassination takes place. So someone's already decided to do it and taking all that into account. No, you're next. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. What I'm looking for is a confounder in the sense that it drives what sort of variable drives both the success of an attempt and the level of progress. Do you want to go or wait? Or come back to it?
I think it's possible that if, as rational as an assassin could be, if they're thinking rationally, then there's consequences for their assassination. So that means that most likely there's already some sort of power struggle in place that might encourage democracy or some sort of alternative form of government to follow the assassination.
Lenin's brother falls under this. He was assassinated. He tried to assassinate Tsar Alexander. Jacob, is there Alexander?
Yeah.
Jacob knows everything. He's one of the reasons. And in that case, it was a country under democratization. or at least an attempted democratization, and we know what happened. But it's a country under the democratization pressures, so they're saying that democratization pressures are driving the attempt. That's the definition of, that's one definition of the time. Oh, there were three more.
Not all the times will be publicly.
Oh. I didn't thought about that. What if there's an attempt that just is suppressed? Oh, or that's one, that's not quite a confounder, that's a sample selection problem, but it falls well within the validating each clause. Yeah.
Actually, like strength of the healthcare system.
Oh.
I can also speak to like the demographics, like health.
Absolutely, so and that's also the category of something that drives both success and intent and the political work of this country. Anyone else? Yeah. How so?
I feel like it's
I believe that's part of their slogan story in a lot of these. Where participation creates pressure and change, if you don't let it out, then these sorts of things can occur. That would certainly be fun. Any, kind of one or two more. Yeah, one.
I'm not sure if this is like before, but if it's a national association stuff. Like it's part of the American Imperialist like democracy building mission.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not something to be sure. How to change this prior.
Which has had varying levels of not success. Right? So, no, seriously. But whether that's coming domestically or internationally, absolutely, I hadn't thought about that. But I think in the people you do restrict plastic events, but I don't know. Last time, all the way back.
Public opinion of assassination.
Okay. So the public opinion, the target can be important, right? So you might wait until someone is not polling at 95% before doing so. And that can also, the public opinion can be driving both the assassination and, you know, the democratization, level of democratization happens. All good ideas. That, thank you, by the way. That all ties into, one of the quotes for us. There are two things. One, it's really easy to come up with these sorts of threats to the validity of the study. Okay? Don't take on error superiority because you do something. We're all trained in putting holes in studies, right? It's very hard to do a study. Wait till you do your thesis, right? Wait till you do a dissertation. Oh my God. It's very hard to do these studies, so you don't get points to recognize. And at the end of the day, we're doing their studies and they're not doing ours. Okay? So we critique without an error, critique in a constructive way, without an error cognizance or dismissiveness of the paper itself. Does that make sense? It's an important post to have a certain amount of humility and modesty when you read and think about these papers. Okay. So this was a natural experiment, meaning that the researcher did not randomize the treatment, but arguably it was randomized. The next study is purely descriptive. The next two studies are purely descriptive. There are no distinctions, there are no causal links. These are literally both are from surveys. And we just want to know what is the relationship, what is some relationship, how do we go, are people's preferences on some issues, things like that. So the first study comes from Berkman and Alhoja, 2020, what did donors want? The basic question they address is, how do Democratic and Republican donors compare to Democratic and Republican voters on social issues? Okay. For those who study or follow American politics, I have a question at least in current days. Is there a gap between people who donate money and people who vote? And what issues and what factors? So that's the question we look at. The questions that they have are originally index. An index can be constructed in more or less fancy ways, but it's a way of taking multiple answers to a question and turning it into a single answer, turning it into a single number. So in that case, you might ask if you want to go, and if you want to index on a specific text, right? You might ask people in a survey, should the capital gains tax go up? Should the estate tax exist? Should people over $200,000 be taxed in order to fund dental or Medicare? Should people under $200,000 be taxed in order to fund for any public college level education and community college, right? And index is created by taking 5 or 6 or 8 or however many of those questions and combining them into one. The simplest index, we'll work with this is different from formally through this semester. The simplest index is just to take the numbers and add them up. Write a series of 0, 1, and 6, just add them up. There's more advanced methods that we might talk about down the line. But the idea of the index is condensing multiple questions into one. So we're going to look at an economic index, a social index, and a globalism index. The economic index combines taxes, healthcare, and so on. The social index combines gay marriage, abortion, and so on. And then the globalism index combines immigration, trade, other questions like that. Okay. One point that we're going to come back to repeatedly in this course is the importance of pre-registering when you can. Pre-registering a study is now common in experiments. I hope this is one of the first observational studies I've seen that out there. Before you run your survey and analyze the results, you write up something called a pre-registration form. It's a document that tells future readers, before you look at your data, here's how the questions I'm going to ask, and here's how I'm going to analyze them. And what that does is by pre-registering the study, you're able to guarantee that the results you get are even chicanery that you've done every single day. We'll talk about this more, but it's possible to take data and manipulate it to say what you want. And we'll get to the end of this, and we'll talk about the replication crisis down the line. But it can be done both maliciously and also naively. So what the authors did was they said, here's our question, here's how we're going to construct our index, then here's how we're going to add it. They declared all of that in advance prior to running the survey. Then after running the survey, they just did what they said they were going to do and sent it off to the and by declaring the analysis prior to seeing the data, it guarantees a level of honesty in your analysis. People know you aren't manipulating it from one end or another. So this is one of the figures from the paper. This is using the original data. They didn't use some information that look at the original. But what I want you to take away from this is the y-axis is the policy domain. So the first row has the economic connection, the second social, the third the globalism index. The M is the median donor. Sorry, the M is the median voter. The dollar sign is the median donor. Depending on case make theory, political scientists are just unduly obsessed with the median. You'll see. But for right now, we'll just take it as a median for now. We'll take that as a given. So in that case, what you'll see is that on the conservatism index, where the right is more conservative, on economic and social issues, the median Democrat is well to the right of the median donor. Whereas on global issues as well. When we look at Republicans, the median on economic issues, the median voting Republican is actually to the left of the voters. These are issues of taxing and spending, size of the social welfare state, effectively. But on social and globalism issues, there's actually agreement between Republican voters and Republican donors. Okay. This is nice. I don't know if people follow these things, but this is more or less matched up with This seems an intuitive understanding of mass politics on these three sets of issues. For a finer look at the data, we can look at these bar charts. And I think I put 4 or 5, but let's look at 1 or 2 of them. But on the left-hand side, are Democratic citizens, on the left-hand side are citizens, on the right-hand side are donors. On the top row are citizens, on the bottom row are donors. Okay? And what you notice is on issues of spending, federal spending on the poor, the Democratic citizens and donors kind of tell the same story. There's at least a similar pattern between these 2 bar charts. Whereas there's really some disagreement between Republican citizens and Republican donors. Republican citizens do want more spending on the poor, Republican donors do not. So there's some disagreement happening here. Let's choose one more. Then if we just did that. Immigration. Yeah, we'll do immigration. So in terms of immigration, what we find in this case is there's actually something of a mismatch with Democratic donors. Democratic donors seem a little more keen on letting more people come in. Whereas Democratic voters are kind of evenly spread across the body or right across the body. So the Democratic donors seem a little more centralized on letting more people in. The Democratic voters seem to spread evenly across the first 4 options. Whereas the Republicans, if we look at those 2 charts, look about the same. The distribution of preferences on immigration is roughly the same between Republican voters and Republican donors, but there's a mismatch on the other preferences. Now, was there anything possible about this? Are we arguing that because people don't make their opinions change? No. But this is a useful tool for understanding mass politics today. One more descriptive study, which goes back, it's a little old, but it's a very nice teaching example. Where we look at the survey and borrow a quote from the original piece. For decades, the Democrats have been viewed as the party of the poor, with the Republicans representing the rich. Recent presidential elections, however, have shown a reverse pattern, with Democrats performing well in the richer blue states and the northeastern coasts, and Republicans dominating the red states in the middle of the country and south. Okay. This paper is 15 years old, but that more or less holds, right? The last election, it was kind of blue, red. And you know, the concentration more or less holds. Coastal trended blue, and there were some, the general pattern still holds today. We can talk about Arizona or Florida or those sorts of things down the line, but as a general trend, this is still the case. So we did this as a final project a few years ago, and this is one of the figures. This is the mean by state of mean income versus proportion Democrats by state. So the study we're looking at is actually Pew survey data, where people rank themselves on a 1 to 5 scale of partisanship. And what we do is actually go through each state, calculate the mean partisanship for each state, and it comes I live on a 1 to 5 scale. So we can calculate the mean income for each state and the mean partisan involved. When you look at it, this is what you get. What this figure tells us is that on average, states that are on average richer tend to vote Democratic. States that are on average poorer tend to vote Republican. Okay. Again, given 2016, 20, that's more or less, more or less things. Now, does that mean that just because richer states are Democratic, that means that richer voters have voted? No. And making that mistake is called an ecological fallacy. That'll have a slide in a moment. But let me show you what happens when we look at the relationship within states. Across states, if we compare the mean of each state, richer states tend to vote more Democratic. Within any given state, richer people tend to vote Republican. And that's indicated by the fact that that line is going upwards for needs. But those blue lines is actually the slope or the relationship between income and partisanship in each state. All right. So this is in part a section of the Minnesota trend, dated, but I think the trend still more or less holds. But in this case, I want to alert you to what's called the ecological fallacy. The ecological fallacy, I'll get to it on the next slide. But the ecological fallacy is looking at this chart of state needs and assuming it tells us something about land. To formalize that, the ecological fallacy is inferring individual behavior from group outcomes. So what I'm going to warn you against is if you want to do your own research on individuals, then you need individual data. You can't use voting precinct data to make claims about individuals. You can't use state level data to make claims about individuals. If you want to make claims that you have state level data, you're saying something about states, not necessarily people in states. If you have precinct level or county level or any sort of jurisdictional level, you can't say anything about the data happening that aggregated up to that. Where did I see this the other day? It was a couple months ago in the New York Times. This is county level data of proportion that voted for Biden versus Trump versus vaccination rates. Counties that voted more for Trump were less likely to have lower vaccination rates. Does that mean within a county that's more extreme Trump voters were less likely to be vaccinated? I do think that's the case because there's individual surveys that verify it. But this figure does not allow us to say. All right. Okay, it's been fun. Enjoy your weekend. I'll see you on the